So this is the Leica Q2 Monochrome, recently announced and released by Leica. This is a completely black and white version of the Leica Q2, which is, in my view, quite a relatively popular yet expensive street photography camera. Now this camera is pretty much identical to that Q2 in almost every regard, except for a few design choices and the fact that this camera only shoots in black and white. It's a monochrome sensor. The color filters have been removed. Now, one of the things that companies that produce black and white cameras say is that a proper black and white camera is always better if you're shooting black and white, because the details are going to be better, it's going to be able to produce sharper results, the tones are going to be better, and so on and so forth. So the image quality differences, they really play them up. So in this video, that's what we're going to compare. We're going to compare this to the original Q2, and we're going to figure out whether it's worth buying a proper black and white camera if you're a black and white enthusiast, or if the image quality differences are pretty much negligible and you could just buy a standard color filter camera, take some pictures, convert them into black and white, and get practically the same results. So when in Leeds, the weather is horrible. Fortunately, these are splash proof, so that might help. Let's go out, take some pictures, and figure out which is better. When it comes to design and specifications, both cameras are almost identical. Like the body, the lens, the ergonomics, most of it is pretty much the same as the original Q2. The only difference is that this has a matte black finish, so it's a little bit sleeker in terms of the design. The leather feels a little bit smoother, and it doesn't have a Leica logo on the front. Also, any of the colored letterings, that's all gone, so it's completely black and white. And some of you may really like that sleek, stealthy kind of look. Others may prefer the colored lettering and the glossy look of the original Q2, but honestly, in terms of like design and build, they're pretty much identical. The major difference between both of these cameras is the sensor. What they've done is they've removed the color filter, and now you can only shoot black and white with this camera. And Leica described this camera as being able to produce sharper, more detailed black and white images in comparison to the original Q2, and it's able to gather more light as well by about a stop in comparison to the other Q2. So image quality, if you're shooting just in black and white, supposedly is going to be a bunch better in this camera than it is in the original Q2. Now, we've taken a few pictures of Sophie in our favorite coffee shop here in Leeds called Hive, and now we're going to go outside, hopefully not catch too much rain, take some more pictures, and also test some of the other features like the low light performance and the dynamic range between both of these cameras. So I know I mentioned that we were going to go outside to take some pictures as well, but honestly, the weather was horrible and I really didn't want to test out how waterproof these cameras were. Instead, we decided to remain inside and continue our comparison. Now that we have all of the images opened up in Lightroom, we can start to take a closer look at these files to see if there's any real benefit of having a black and white only camera. First couple of images, if we zoom in 1:1, settings are exactly the same. You know, in terms of detail and clarity, I'm not really seeing that much of a difference. I'm going to say that the raw files from the Q2 tend to have a little bit more contrast and the highlights appear a little bit stronger, whereas the highlights seem a bit softer in the same scenario with the Q2. The Monochrome. I just find that images from the Monochrome tend to have a little less contrast and they have a little bit of a softer look, not in terms of like detail, but softer in terms of lighting. So that's the only real difference that I'm seeing. So over here you can see how contrast is just a little bit stronger on the Q2, but that's pretty much all that I'm noticing. For the second set of images, I mean, the difference is very similar in terms of detail and clarity. I'm really not seeing that much of a difference. But once again, contrast is just a little bit stronger on the Q2, whereas on the Monochrome, just a little softer in terms of the contrast. And that's pretty much all that I'm seeing in terms of the difference. The highlights are just a little softer in comparison to the highlights on the Q2. But to be fair, that change can be done in post on the original Q2 as well. So I'm not going to say that that's a major benefit. But for some of you out there, you know, I don't know, maybe that's a benefit. But to me, I'm not seeing a great deal of difference. Even when it comes to macro mode, I really can't see any more detail or clarity from the Monochrome compared to the original Q2. Like both of these images, they were focused over here. And, you know, there are subtle differences, very subtle differences in terms of like tonality and such. So some of you out there might see the benefit of that, but personally, I'm not seeing a great deal of difference in that regard. Detail, clarity, sharpness, very, very, very similar. I mean, the differences are negligible at best, but there's definitely somewhat of a look from the Monochrome versus the Q2. So maybe that's what it is, but I really can't tell them apart. The only real difference that I could see between the Monochrome and the original Q2 was low light performance. When you're shooting in low light, the Monochrome is definitely better in low light by quite a significant amount. Now this is at 12,500 and this is at 6,400. And even though this is a stop higher at the ISO, this is still cleaner than the 6,400 image. It's incredible how good the Monochrome is in low light. It's more than a stop better. I'm going to say maybe a stop and a half. Potentially even 2 stops better when it comes to low light performance. So if you need really fantastic low light performance, then the Monochrome is definitely the camera. Even 1 stop higher, it's cleaner than the original Q2. So Leica's done a fantastic job in adjusting the low light parameters and getting the most out of the sensor by removing some of the color filters. Even when shooting in a controlled environment with flash at the same ISO, you can see how much more noise the original Q2 is going to produce at high ISO compared to the Monochrome. The Monochrome at 6400 is pretty fantastic. I mean, it is very clean considering how high the ISO is, and compared to the original Q2, you can see over here just how much more noise there is in the Q2. So yeah, low light performance, the Q2 does a fantastic job. It also doesn't seem to lose quite as much detail in comparison to the Q2. So I think Leica's done a brilliant job in that regard. Finally, the dynamic range on the Monochrome is noticeably better than the Q2. These are a couple of images that have been recovered in post, and if we zoom in, you can see that at the base ISO, at the respective base ISOs, the Monochrome is better when it comes to recovering those details in the shadow. There's more noise in the Q2 than there is on the Monochrome. So dynamic range and low light performance, the Monochrome is definitely better. You are going to see a very noticeable difference between the two cameras. However, when it comes to like just the look, the detail, the sharpness and the clarity, I honestly can't really see any extra detail or any great benefit aside from low light and dynamic range. Both of them are pretty much identical in terms of the detail and clarity, and in terms of the look of the black and white files. I mean, I guess it comes down to personal preference, but I'm not seeing a great deal of difference. So, conclusions. Honestly, it's difficult to say that this is good value for money because you're sacrificing a lot. You're sacrificing the whole color filter and the flexibility of being able to shoot color and black and white for something that costs more that only shoots in black and white. But in all fairness, that's kind of like a shtick. You know, that's what they do. They remove filters and charge a little bit more for it. And it works for that particular crowd, for that particular market of photographers. So I get what Leica's doing with this system. In terms of image quality, whether it's better or not, real world conditions, it's not really that much better. Yes, you know, some of you may be able to say, yes, it's, you know, worth it or whatever. But honestly, in terms of actual image quality in real world shooting scenarios, there isn't really that much in it. So it's a difficult thing for me to say, this is a great camera and I highly recommend it. Having said that, I get why people would want to, you know, people who are really interested in black and white photography, who are like hardcore black and white photographers, I get why they'd be interested in this, because even the model that we were shooting with today, Sophie, she loves black and white pictures, and this camera was exactly the kind of camera that she would enjoy shooting with. So I get the allure, I get that there's a market for it, and I appreciate that. Personally, I think I'd rather spend a little less and get the original Q2, but there's still something quite nice about this. Anyway, just want to say thank you so much for watching our video. If you like this video, hit the like button, please subscribe, share this video, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Thank you.